At no point has it been stated that the criminal is of lower worth and we need to rehabilitate them to show that they're of equal worth. No, the statement that's been made in the criminal action is that the criminal is of greater worth. And that's the statement that needs to be corrected. Yeah, Sam.
Why should we think that punishment is the best way of nullifying or defeating the expressive expression that like the victim is low? Why not just a statement issued from a body like?
Does a statement asserting this person is of no greater worth than someone else?
Well, I mean, if we're looking at expression, I feel like I just don't see that argument. Basically, the question I'm trying to make punishment as a trying to refute the statement or expression that.
All you get if the state merely expresses a contrary opinion is a disagreement between the criminal's own view of their worth and the state's view of their worth. However, if the criminal is mastered by the infliction of some painful defeat, then you no longer have just a disagreement of opinion, you have a demonstration that the victim, or that the criminal is not superior. It's been demonstrated by the fact that they have been mastered in a way that merely asserting that they're no better doesn't do.
Yeah, okay, I guess I can see. If the
Christopher continues, yeah, but the idea that they need to be rehabilitated is that they need to be taught that they are not of greater worth here. That their actions were in excess of their worth. I mean, it might have the effect that they no longer believe that they are, but it still wouldn't nullify the statement that they had made in their criminal action. That's her view. I mean, the statement made in the criminal action needs to be nullified by a demonstration that the statement was false. And the way to demonstrate that the statement was false is to lower, through a defeat, the criminal. Anyway, that's the idea. But these are good questions. I should be a little bit suspicious because I like this view so much that I'm being unfairly not critical of it. So I welcome these kinds of I'm defending her, but like I'm not saying you can't make out good claims for alternative means of reestablishing the expressive, the truth about the worth of human beings, short of or by other means than inflicting pain. But it's clear. I think it's clear why she thinks the basic line is pretty clear, but I think you could certainly quibble with it. But still, another hand, yeah.
so
Yeah. Right. I'm pretty sure she would say, no, that just, right, that straight out nullifies the worth of the criminal. Okay. What about for murder? Well, but sometimes proportionality, it can never be more harsh than is warranted by the act, but it sometimes may have to be less harsh than would be proportional, right? Because we're not after proportionality per se, we're after expressing the equal moral worth of the victim and the criminal as persons, and doing something that is essentially demeaning, that essentially reduces the criminal to an object, treats them as having lower worth than a person. Right? What we want to do is nullify the impression that they're of higher worth. But no more. We don't want to give the impression that the criminal does not have the value of a person.
Reading the view that see it as see worth as human some ways that I guess and there's that's like
yeah, I mean, like the aim isn't to have it appear that the victim and the criminal are of equal worth per se. It's that they are equally of the value of persons. So if the criminal kills the victim, they've treated them as having no worth. Okay? We can also treat the criminal as having no worth by killing them, in which case our expression about the criminal matches the criminal's expression about the victim, but neither one is true. We want to reassert the truth, which is that both are entitled to the respect due persons. And you can't do that by killing somebody off. Okay. So this line gives her an opportunity to discuss a second retributivist idea. And this is the expressive validation of equal worth, again, of persons as such, now not through punishment, but through protection. So the criminal law, as designed to protect individuals, is now to be understood as itself, it's protecting persons is a way of expressing equal worth. So the fact of punishment, when it occurs, reasserts equal worth. It acts as a sting, but it also acts as a sting, right, that prevents expressions of unequal value. That is to say, the punishment reasserts the unequal worth and also makes it, the idea is that the criminal is, it will disincentivize that sting, and the threat of that sting will disincentivize expressions of unequal value, thereby leaving only assertions of equal value. And the threat of that punishment, right, that the idea that we will punish you if you exert mastery over others, also expresses the equal value. It says, right, the truth about the equal value of persons will stand despite it will be reasserted in the event that you say anything to the contrary. That's a way of expressing this equal value. And her point here is, I think, really to use this expressivist analysis to then turn around and say, okay, well, what do our practices of punishment and enforcement and the implementation of our criminal laws actually say? What do those things say about our actual values? Do they say we think all human beings are of equal worth as persons? Because if they don't, if our practices of punishment do not reflect equal value and they are understood as expressive of our values, then right, we can infer from the practices of punishment what the values of a society actually are. We can infer how society values individuals from, the extent to which its criminal laws in fact protect them from expressions of unequal value, and the extent to which those laws are enforced and punishments are meted out. So, look, in fact, violence against African Americans is not punished as highly as that against whites. Just isn't. In fact, the rich get away with lighter sentences for the same crimes. In fact, we have laws against rape, but only 1 in 15 or 16 rapists ever sees the inside of a jail cell. So her point here, made, I think, quite obliquely, is that, turn this mirror of expression on us. What do you see? You see a society that values white, wealthy men in its punishment practices. And that right, sees that our practices are expressive of the value that persons are not of equal value. Women are not of equal value to men. People of color are not of equal value to white people. And she just, look, that's what we're saying, right? When we punish unequally, when we treat the opioid epidemic as a healthcare problem, but the crack epidemic as a criminal problem, for example. What are we saying about, because who's hit hardest by the opioid epidemic? Rural white people. Who's hit hardest by the crack epidemic? Urban black people. One of them is a healthcare problem, the other is criminality. I mean, just chew on that for a while. What does that say? And that's the point she's making at the end. Okay. So much for Hampton. Now let's move on to Barnett. Things get really funky. Oops. Okay. Restitution. So, consequentialist views of criminal enforcement try to get some benefit out of it. It's right. You don't punish unless there's a benefit to be gotten by way of special or general deterrence. The problem with that is that it looks like, well, we're just using the fact of violative behavior as an excuse to use the criminal for some ulterior purpose that we wouldn't otherwise use them for. But that doesn't justify using them for that purpose. Restitution, looking backward at the criminal's action as justifying their subsequent treatment, has the problem that it can be difficult to make out what good comes of it. So what it's for, though Morris and Hampton both seek to do so. But the problem is that it's the victim that got harmed. And it's not obvious in either Morris's analysis or Hampton's analysis what good punishment, retribution does for the victim, who was the actual person harmed. I mean, it's one thing to say that, well, the criminal's expression of their mastery has been nullified, right? But think of it from the victim's standpoint. I care about the fact that my leg was broken and my car was stolen more than I care about whether a false assertion was made about me relative to the criminal, right? So what, great, now my value's been reasserted, but I'm still out $1,000 and a broken leg, okay? Restitution is the basic idea of restitution is that it's the victim that was harmed and the victim who is owed some sort of compensation from the criminal in order to be made whole. That is the function of criminal justice. Yeah.
How far apart were these two?
Not long.
I didn't.
Hampton's is, I think, early 70s, and Barnett is, I don't know, 80 something. Okay, but Barnett doesn't just start off saying restitution is the thing that we should be focusing on. He says, look, criminal punishment, the criminal justice system is in a ruin. It's in crisis. And it needs to be replaced. Now, what he's doing here is he's extending Thomas Kuhn's sort of analysis of scientific revolutions to the domain of criminal enforcement. So Kuhn, you familiar with Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions? Okay. So Kuhn, I guess it came out in 1962, I think, itself a revolutionary text in the history and philosophy of science. Kuhn basically said, look, throughout history, there have been a number of instances in which, there were what are called scientific revolutions. A scientific revolution occurs when a going paradigm for how you think about a certain domain in the natural sciences, when that paradigm comes under enormous pressure because of all sorts of internal incoherencies, inconsistencies, complications. But a paradigm is like a theory along with a set of working assumptions and practices which people undertake what he calls normal science. Have their experimental paradigms, they do what they do, blah, 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 blah. But it can happen that a whole lot of anomalous results crop up so that it becomes enormously difficult to maintain the coherency and plausibility of the view of the overall framework. But that's not enough to yield a revolution. What you need is for an alternative paradigm to come on the scene. Now, the alternative paradigm, when it's new, is it's going to strike most people as completely alien, weird, wrong, right? Think of the shift from the geocentric universe of Ptolemy to the heliocentric universe of Copernicus. I mean, the idea that the sun was the center of things was nuts. How could the sun be the center? You're saying that the Earth is flying around the sun at thousands and thousands of miles an hour? Why don't we all just fly off of it? You see, the Earth is rotating very quickly. Like, if that's true, then why, if I drop a heavy object from the top of a tower and the Earth is actually moving fast, why does the ball or whatever, the heavy object, why does that fall right to the base of the tower? If the right, why hasn't the tower moved while the ball is falling, right? I mean, it was just nuts to think that the sun was the center of the universe and the earth is flying around at 1,000,000 miles or whatever, thousands of miles an hour. Ridiculous. But the geocentric paradigm, right, that had Aristotelian physics behind it, and right, all of those observations of heavenly motion from the new astronomers and their telescopes were impossible to square, or very difficult to square with the theory that the stars are rotating around the Earth. And that led to enormous complications, in the light of which even a whack job theory like the Earth is at the center, right, became a plausible place to go. Now, that's an example of a scientific revolution. You get a paradigm that comes under pressure and a new paradigm that seems wacky at first, despite its wackiness, can take over because of the crisis in the original paradigm. Okay, but it's that model, that is what Barnett is working with here. The current criminal system is like a paradigm in science, and it's under enormous pressure. The restitution view is a new and different paradigm, and it might look crazy at first. It's certainly not fully worked out, and there will have there'll be some intuitive features of it, or some features of it that will just rub your intuitions exactly the wrong way. But we can't stick with the current paradigm. We ought to give this new one a try. And that's the overarching kind of structure of what he's going to be filling out here. I just want to say, Kuhnian paradigms in science are very specific kinds of things. They are theories in the technical sense, with bodies of, with small communities of people engaging in fairly tightly constrained set of practices and employing a fairly tightly constrained set of methodologies within the normal business of working out that theory. The criminal system, as it is nothing like that. So my point is just that he's extending Kuhn's analysis perhaps beyond anything that Kuhn himself would think appropriate. The kinds of anomalies that arise in the context of normal science as the limitations of a paradigm become clear are very different than the kinds of problems he is pointing to with the criminal system. So it's just not clear that he's entitled to the glory that comes with tacking on, Kuhn's celebrated analysis of scientific revolutions to his own shtick here. That's just a sort of caveat before we get going. Okay, so the basic idea here, again, the criminal system is in crisis. Restitution is a replacement paradigm, which is radically different in theory and implementation. And it's fundamental, that is predicated fundamentally on the idea that crime is a violation of the victim's rights, not society's rights. So, what's so bad about the punishment paradigm? Punishment is understood as the infliction of an unpleasantness. So punishment has to be justified. right? It's the infliction of harm, so it must be justified. You can't inflict harm without a justification. And as we've already seen, there are two classes of justification for the punishment paradigm. He calls them political justifications, by which he means consequentialist, utilitarian sorts of justifications. And then there's, well, let's just talk about, right, let's talk about the problems with the political justifications. So, political justifications for incarceration. Well, I'll just say the other kind is what he's going to call the moral justification. That is essentially the retributivist view. We saw Morris and Hampton offered different versions of that. So, political justifications for incarceration. There are at least three. One of them is, right, that it disables the criminal in question from committing further crime. That's called specific deterrence. Deters specifically that individual. Well, what's wrong with that? Why is that justification not compelling? Well, it's incredibly expensive. And moreover, it places a double burden on society. Society has to suffer the crime itself and then pay to support the criminal while they're incarcerated. Okay? It has only temporary benefits. It only keeps them from, right, committing crimes as long as they're in jail. Right? So in order to get full benefit from specific deterrence, right, you have to pay for them to spend the rest of their lives in jail. And in fact, criminals are released with a rather higher probability of doing criminal acts than when they went in. So recidivism, we increase the probability with respect to that individual that they will do crime after they're released. Another sort of political consequentialist view is rehabilitation. The idea here is that we're going to change the criminal's mental habits so as to reform them and reduce the likelihood of future criminal activity, making them suitable to return into the general population. Now, surely successful rehabilitation would be a good, but think of what you're doing there. Rehabilitation means manipulating an individual to alter their mental habits. And that is a scary sort of idea. And so rehabilitation would be good, but it is unclear that the benefit that you actually get can justify the degree of manipulation and interference involved. And if you generalize the idea that society has a right to change its citizens' mental outlooks for political reasons, that is a terribly scary idea. Although, of course, society does it all the time, right? And usually the political reasons are economic, generally, or in order to secure power for oneself. But it is indeed a scary idea. Besides, it involves the dubious assumption that harming somebody, imprisoning them or whatever, actually can improve their mental outlook. I mean, as a matter of practice, rehabilitation doesn't work. Then there's general deterrence. This is the idea that if you punish people, then other people will take that as a lesson that they should not commit crimes. We've got two different aspects here. There's the effect of past punishments on future conduct. That's right, what actual instances of punishment from the past do to the likelihood of future misconduct. And then there's the effect of the threat of punishment on future conduct. The connection between those is that the threats are ineffective unless there are past instances of actual punishment. If all I ever do is threat, I'm the boy crying wolf, right? Unless there's occasionally a wolf around. So if all I do is threaten you with punishment, but I never follow through on it, my threats become empty. Here, right, general deterrence here is the idea that the criminal is used to teach society a lesson. As I emphasized in talking about consequentialist justifications for punishment, they don't even deserve to be called punishment because, right, using someone as a means of teaching society a lesson isn't a matter of their criminal activity being a reason that justifies their punishment. It's just an occasion we take advantage of to provide a didactic benefit for society in the form of inflicting a harm on the person. So general deterrence is sort of morally unjustifiable because it doesn't treat the person's, rather, punishment for general deterrence reasons, harming someone for general deterrence reasons, is morally unjustifiable because it doesn't link their past actions to their treatment in the relevant way. Look, you can get general deterrence by punishing anyone you can make out did something wrong, whether they did it or not. So the fact that they did something wrong is not essential to the logic of general deterrence. Moreover, the aim of deterrence is no guide at all as to how we should limit punishment in accordance with justice. So, right, it's no guide to proportionality. You know, we want to deter people from engaging in a certain activity. I guess the best way to deter them is to punish a few examples extremely severely, even if the thing we want to deter people from doing isn't that big a deal, right? Still, we don't want them to do it, so let's punish a few people really, really severely. The logic of deterrence doesn't say that there's anything wrong with that, but surely there is. Okay, the upshot here is not that these goals are bad, or that they're not, in fact, to some extent achieved by punishment. The point is that the goals can't justify punishment. They are incidental benefits of it, but not justifications for imposing harm on the criminal. And that's just the broad point that I've made time and again, that consequentialist accounts of punishment aren't really accounts of punishment. They're accounts of using a person's behavior as an excuse to squeeze some benefit out of them that we ordinarily would not be entitled to do. Yeah, Sam.
What's the difference again between the future consequences and actual punishment?
So actually punishing somebody can be expected to have consequences on other people's behavior. Okay? So too can threatening to punish someone. All right, so think of the first time a criminal statute is passed. No one has been ever convicted under it, but there are provisions for penalties should you engage in that behavior. That'll deter some people. Okay? Because of the threat, even though there's never been any punishment for that. As will actual punishment of people. Right? That's the difference. Okay. Moral justifications, and this is retributivism. The idea that punishment of offenders is good for its own sake, is intrinsically good somehow. Problems here, well, just not obviously true. In part because it's in tension with other moral principles that we hold, equally important. Turn the other cheek. Right? Do not visit harm with harm. I mean, our moral principles principles are pretty confused as far as whether punishment is a good thing. Mercy, we're supposed to be merciful and forgive people too, right? We're supposed to leave vengeance to the Lord. So, vengeance is mine, saith the Lord, right? That means it's not yours. Right? So our actual moral principles are pretty unclear or contradictory on this point. So it's not clearly true that punishment of offenders is good for its own sake. And even if it is the case that punishment of offenders is good for its own sake, say for reasons that Morris or Hampton would give, that doesn't show that it is acceptable for us. Sorry, this should say bring about the harm or just do the harm. Right? It doesn't show that it's acceptable for us to bring about the harm that brings about that abstract good of punishment for its own sake. Now you might say, the real problem with punishment, right, the punishment paradigm, is that it's not administered swiftly and surely. But Barnett says, well, look, maybe we should ask why it isn't swift and sure. I mean, it could be, right? There's no in principle impossibility to having a system of justice in which punishment is swift and sure. Barnett says, punishment involves subjecting someone to a harm. That is essential to the idea of punishment. And subjecting someone to a harm, generally speaking, leads to sympathy for them. So we have some sympathy for the criminal in light of the fact that our way of treating criminals is to harm them. And maybe that's why we're a little reluctant to get real busy and efficient with that. Secondly, punishment leaves the victim out altogether, generally speaking, and therefore gives them no motive to help secure convictions. If victims got something out of it, maybe they would be more eager to participate in criminal investigations and prosecutions, and it would be swifter and more certain. But as it is, the victim is regarded as a sunk cost, and they get nothing out of the process. So have little incentive to speed it up. Moreover, punishment does nothing to help criminals succeed in the outside world. Merely causing someone pain doesn't make them better able to cope with society. And so the reasons we have to do it effectively and swiftly and speedily, surely, are pretty thin. Because we don't actually expect the criminal to be benefited by their punishment in a way that redounds to the good of society. So why would we be so eager to bother with the expense and make it sure and swift? So what he's going to be doing is arguing that, look, these are some problems with the punishment paradigm. I'm going to fix them with the restitution paradigm. I'm going to we're not going to think of punishment of criminal enforcement as a matter of causing someone harm. We're not going to think of criminal enforcement in a way that leaves the victim out. We're not going to think of criminal enforcement as a way that does nothing to help criminals succeed in the outside world. So you might say, look, okay, so there's problems with the punishment paradigm. But we can fix it. We can salvage the paradigm. We can require proportionality. And he says that's simply doomed to failure. Doomed to failure because of the incommensurability of punishment with crime. Right? There is no objective standard by which to commensurate the harm done by punishment or the whatever the value the value of punishment with the cost of the crime. They're of the wrong coin. The cost of the crime is right. But punishing the criminal is causing them a harm. How does that? How do you make that proportional to whatever harm they did? There's no objective standard for that. Now, I'm just a little puzzled by what he means here. Wouldn't the eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth be a way of making them proportional? Why are they? See, what I think is he's tending to see the harms done to victims on an economic model. The harm done to the victim is something that they could be, right? We could figure out a way to pay for that harm monetarily, but punishing someone, in contrast, does nothing to, as it were, make up for the cost of the crime they committed. Punishment, that's, I think, what he means by there's no standard of commensurability. You can't put a monetary value on the harm you cause the criminal in a way that makes up for the monetary harm that they've done. It's just more harm, right, is the idea, I believe. But we could get more serious about rehabilitation so that we actually do make the criminal better. And here he just says, look, we have a lot of experience with this. The political nature of a government-run penal system makes this impossible. Officers of penal system, wardens, etc., have no incentives beyond the incentive of keeping order in their jails. And incarcerated criminals have basically no incentives to improve themselves. It's going to be really central to the restitution paradigm that it be structured in a way that does provide incentives to do more than just keep order where there are incarcerated criminals. And that does provide those criminals with an incentive to improve themselves. Finally, you can have victim compensation statutes. This will involve now, right, upon conviction, well, indeed, it's usually not contingent on conviction. Victim compensation statutes bring the victim in, right, so that their harm is somehow addressed. The compensation, though, comes from the state rather than the victim. It's a matter of grace. It's usually limited to violent crime. Why should it be limited to violent crime? Why not crimes against property? And it always, in practice, presumes a punishment element, the infliction of a harm as well. All right, so I'm going to stop there. Next time we will begin with an outline of the new paradigm, restitution. So I think he's made a very good case that the punishment paradigm is a shambles. And he's certainly right about that. Whether you're going to think the restitution paradigm, given what